Okay, folks, well, welcome to today's exciting and auspicious event, the free lunch, and also, in addition to this, the launch of two fabulous books, Decolonising Intervention by our visiting fellow Meera Subbaratnam, and the book International Intervention in Local Politics by Shahar Hamiri, Carolyn Hughes and Fabio Scarpello. Fabio has taken the prudent choice of visiting us but choosing to remain at the back of the room to potentially heckle his co-author. To give you a sense of the format today, which I think is a really interesting and exciting and innovative format, the scholars will speak critically but appreciatively, presumably more appreciatively than critically, about one another's works, starting with who would like to begin. Shahar, would you like to begin? So Shahar will speak to Meera's book, Meera will speak to Shahar, Carolyn and Fabio's book, and then we will open it up to enthusiastic and excoriating Q&A.
Thank you very much, Andrew, and thank you very much all for coming this afternoon. Please enjoy the food, otherwise we're going to have to stay back and eat all of it, which is not going to be pretty. So the first thing, I actually wanted to go first because I have a little vignette in relation to Meera, and I wanted to be the one that actually that tells you about it. I've known Meera for quite a long time. We actually met in the wilds of San Francisco, I believe, somewhere around March or April 2008. That was my very first International Studies Association annual convention. And at that point, although I was approaching the end of my PhD, I had not actually been to any major international conference. So arriving at the ISA, witnessing something on that scale, many people in this room would know what I'm talking about, 5,000 to 6,000 people. I didn't know anyone, so it was both kind of overwhelming and underwhelming at the same time, a very strange feeling that it took me a long time to compute. The feeling didn't get a lot better when I arrived to present my paper, which was on the last session of the last day of the International Studies Association Conference. So that was the graveyard shift. And many of you who know what it looks like would know that there was practically no one there. There were 3 people in the audience and something like 7 or 8 of us behind the table. So again, that didn't make me feel a hell of a lot better about the whole process. And I just thought to myself, well, I'm here, I might as well present my paper. So I presented the paper. And then afterwards, approached me a person that I know is Meera, who I didn't know at the time. And she told me that she is one of the editors of the journal Millennium, which is an excellent journal, for those of you who don't know, that's edited by students in the London School of Economics. And she was, lucky for me, I suppose, one of the 3 editors of the journal at the time. And she said she enjoyed my paper, and she asked me if I wanted to submit that paper to Millennium. And I said, yes. So I did. And what happened after that is, like any other paper, it went through the peer review process, and it did actually get published with Millennium, albeit in a much revised version, which hopefully I think made it better. But nonetheless, that moment actually gave me a lot of confidence later on in my career, because it was sort of moving from a situation where I felt like I got nothing out of that conference to feeling like actually the work is potentially interesting to other people. There are people that potentially appreciate the kind of work that I'm doing. And I kind of took that with me later on. So thank you, Meera. You really helped my career. You helped my self-esteem, not to the extent that it needs assistance anyway. But I still remember very, very fondly, and obviously we kept in touch ever since, given that we work on relatively, or at least used to work on relatively similar issues. And as a result, I've been quite familiar with the work that Meera herself has produced. So it is therefore really excellent for me to be the person now that is here to launch a book. I know it's been a while in the making, but I think it was worth the wait. It's a fantastic book, and I'll tell you a little bit about it. But before we discuss the actual book, I think it's worthwhile saying that international intervention, in my view, and I don't think that Meera will disagree, is actually a relatively poorly understood phenomenon in our discipline. And I think the reason for that is because it doesn't sit neatly in one of the typical silos of the field. It's neither quite international relations, it's neither quite comparative politics or anything like that. And that is because, especially the kind of intervention that we talk about in the post-Cold War period, on the one hand, they are international, they involve international actors operating internationally, but on the other hand, what they do in quite significant ways changes how countries and societies do their business domestically, if you like. So they maintain the formal sovereignty of states, but they're quite significantly changing their domestic circumstances, or at least sometimes they do. So this blind spot of the discipline, I think, is quite a big problem, because actually these interventions have been quite common in the post-Cold War period. There have been a lot of interventions of various kinds, especially of the kind of peace-building, state-building variety, which is the one that both of the books actually talk about. So the fact that we don't, or at least many of the studies out there don't actually understand intervention particularly well is actually a problem, I think. Now, in the absence of good tools for understanding international intervention, the best really that international relations as a discipline has had to offer in this area most of the time has been the concept of hybridity. So hybridity essentially sees the outcomes of international intervention as a little bit of this, the international liberal interveners coming in, and a little bit of that, which is the non-liberal, presumably non-liberal recipients of intervention. But even proponents of hybridity have more recently, in some occasions at least, had to acknowledge that the concept is limited both descriptively, analytically, and normatively in some cases. So I think one of the things that brings the two books together, the two books that I discussed today, and I do think that it's quite fortuitous that we get to launch them together, because they are actually quite similar in many ways. So I think one of the things that brings the books together is actually this attempt to move beyond these limitations and develop more forward-facing approaches to understanding international intervention today. Now I'll move to talk specifically about Mira's book, Decolonizing Intervention. One of the great things, apart from the book itself, is the fact that Mira has always been committed to open access publishing, and this book is available open access. Anyone here can go immediately at the end of this session, or even now, and download the book and have a look for themselves. And you don't even have to pirate it. That's great. That's what I would have done. So talking about decolonizing intervention, Mira, I think a starting problem, a puzzle, is one that anyone with even a cursory understanding of how these things work would have surely noted by now, which is this kind of curious problem where on the one hand, interveners continue to implement and attempt very expensive projects and programs, while at the same time, both them and the targets of their intervention have a sense that these things just don't work, but they continue to do that. So that's where Mira starts the study. It's essentially a study of the failure of intervention. Now, the case study of Mozambique, which is the empirical focus of the book, is actually very appropriate for that study, for that focus, because it is often seen as a success story of peace building and international intervention. So, it makes Mozambique a hard test case for studying failure. Now, the specific argument that Mira is making is that interventions are failing and continue to fail because they are constituted through structural relations of colonial difference between the interveners and the targets of intervention, which shape intervention's conception, operation, and effects. They maintain, and in fact reinforce, she argues, ways of looking at the world and the material consequences associated with them that continue to distinguish between advanced and backward people, developed and developing, so on and so forth, even when the best intentions are present. This is a condition that cannot be easily escaped. So intervention's failures are therefore, in her view, and I agree with that, structural. They're built in. They're not the result of poor implementation, sequencing, or any other technocratic explanation that is often brought out to explain why things don't work. Now, the book is quite unique and, in my view, refreshing in building theory from the bottom up. Mira focuses almost entirely on interventions, on the targets of interventions. How do they view the politics of intervention after 2 or 3 decades of experience in intervention? Now, Mira is, of course, not the first to look at the targets of intervention, but she seeks to harness their perspectives towards a decolonial approach to studying international intervention. What that approach attempts to do is to rescue the analysis from the theories and concepts associated with hierarchies of race and empire, which hybridity, for instance, or many other so-called critical accounts in the scholarship arguably do not manage to escape. So as such, and she probably hasn't made that many friends doing that, Mira takes aim at the Eurocentrism of both mainstream interventionist approaches and much of the critical scholarship on international intervention. This Eurocentrism, she argues, compellingly, is not just normatively objectionable, but in fact undermines the proper understanding of international interventions and their effects. In fact, many of the so-called critical approaches could be argued to be doing exactly the opposite of decolonizing intervention, even when they're strongly committed, apparently, to uncovering the agency of locals. What is hybridity, really, if not a reification of the assumed binary between the West and the rest? It is this very assumed difference between interveners and their targets that is seen to produce hybrid peace, hybrid governance, and so on and so forth. Now, coming from a different perspective, I still share Mira's critique of these approaches. I therefore love their efforts to produce an understanding of international intervention and its effect through the eyes of its targets that is free of essentialist presumptions about their real subjectivities, beliefs, and customs. The book sees the people of Mozambique as full agents in their own right, even if sometimes operating under structural conditions not of their own making or choosing. Also, by refusing to ratify a primordialist differentiation of interventions, interveners and their targets, but see it as reproduced through the practices of intervention itself, the book avoids assuming the liberal nature of international intervention because it's not really experienced as liberal by the people being intervened upon. Consequently, her analysis shed genuinely new light on the subject matter. Now, Mira, just in brief, because I don't want to go over all the content of the book, I encourage everyone here to read it. But just in conclusion, she identifies 4 key dynamics that is inherent in international intervention. The first is protagonismo, which I'm not sure, is that taken from Italian?
It's the Portuguese.
Portuguese, sorry, yeah.
Italian too.
Yeah. Yeah, okay, so that is the tendency for interveners to always need to see themselves as driving change in areas in which intervention occurs. This, she argues, is a structural dynamic that limits efforts to cede genuine ownership to intervention's targets, even when that is the intention. The second is the dynamic of disposability. The relations of colonial differentiation, which portray the intervened people as without history or ideas in many cases, also produce a sense among the interveners that not much is actually at stake here. If programs fail, well, that's not too bad, we'll just try something else. But that actually ignores the efforts and lost energies associated with failed intervention from the perspective of its targets. The third dynamic is the sense of entitlement, and anyone that's ever been to those places where intervention occurs will know exactly what she's talking about here. In fact, the cover of our book shows the line of Toyota Land Cruisers that sort of traveling through the Cambodian countryside. So the third point is the sense of entitlement among the interveners that produces efforts among public servants in recipient or target states to attain similar levels of luxury and comfort for themselves, therefore fragmenting these states even further. Finally, aid also produces material dependency among its recipients, but this dependency is fragile. When the resources dry up, in many cases, the targets of intervention do things differently to the way that the interveners initially had wanted. Now, all these things come together, these pervasive and structural patterns, they generate alienation among the targets of intervention, they keenly understand the gap between intervention stated ambitions of state building, capacity building, and so on and so forth, and the reality of intervention, which looks quite different. These patterns can also, according to Mira, not be reformed because they're constitutive, sorry, it's a very tough word for me, of the colonial relations of difference that make the project of state building both desirable and possible in the first place. Now, if I have only one criticism of this excellent book, it is, in my view, that focusing on target society's perspective and intervention, in doing that, the book still does not fully examine the social, political, and ideological divisions within those societies and how these cleavages and hierarchies themselves interact with the intervention to produce variable outcomes. Now, we know that international intervention produce highly uneven outcomes. There are many failures, but there are also some successes. Often those successes should not be understood in their own terms, and I'm sure that Mira would agree with that point. But nonetheless, they're sort of interesting to understand. Why is that unevenness there? So failure is rife, but successes are also worth studying, not least because they're rarely due to the factors emphasized by the interveners. So rescuing the targets of intervention from Eurocentrism and giving them agency, which I think is a very important objective, and the book does that incredibly well. I think also requires paying attention to the power relations that run through those target societies and how they are shaping the outcomes of intervention. And what we have found in our own research and what I found in earlier work is that actually interveners are a lot weaker than people often think they are, and very unsuccessful at detaining, very weak, much weaker relative to the targets of intervention than is often assumed. So just to conclude, I'd like to congratulate Mira again on her achievement. It's an excellent book. I recommend all of you read it here. But as always, I look forward to keeping in touch, seeing you at the ISA and your future work. Thank you.
Terrific.
Thank you, Shaha. It was extraordinarily generous, and it's so delightful to know that someone has actually read your book from cover to cover. It's really quite an exciting thing. And thank you all for coming along. I mean, I totally agree with Shaha that actually our books approach the subject matter from a very sympathetic basis, that both of us, and I think both of us were coming through it about the same time. When I was at that ISA conference, I was also very early on in my PhD, and looking for things that I was interested in, and not just things that I might want to publish in Millennium. And I remember going to that last panel on the last day, because I was young and stupid, but really being delighted to see Shaha's presentation, because finally something clicked. I thought this, what he's saying really makes sense, and the story he was telling was about the question of state transformation as an alternative interpretation of what has been perceived in policy and in much of the literature as an attempt to do capacity building. And it's this idea which also animates this book. So just to take you through it a little bit, in political science, if you like, the dominant view in comparative politics has been to treat states like little containers, each doing their own thing, and then we study them internally, and we study them comparatively. So I'm going to have a problem with that word maybe. But, we study them comparatively, so we treat them as like units, and they are relatively, at least as far as analysis is concerned, they're hermetically sealed. And then you layer onto this, if you like, this Weberian understanding of the state as having a kind of monopoly on violence, as being a rational, legal, bureaucratic order, and you throw this into the mix with a policy environment that's interested in state failure and state collapse. So the stated aim of a lot of the state-building policy at the time was to just build up state capacity. And this seems completely unobjectionable. It seems completely technocratic. You've got a model of a state, what it should look like. You've got all these other states which are not quite states. So we just go in and we assist, and you build up all of the relevant ministries and functions and carry on. Now, what Shaha's work did in that paper and in his earlier work was say, look, we're not just building some random state here. Actually, this is all taking place in a context where the very functions of the state are being transformed by wider global processes. And this is related to the literature by Bob Jessup and Poulantzas, who draw on this idea of the transformation of the state. What is going on under, if you like, neoliberalism is the reparceling of the state into a set of governance agencies. So we're not thinking about, if you like, a container or a black box, but a set of governing processes that take place transnationally, and actually to which a lot of domestic states have to themselves conform. And when you look at what has happened to the states, not just in the global south, but in the global north over the last several decades, it's clear that this transformative element of what the state is about and who it works for and what it's doing is at the center of it. And I think this has been one of the most important insights, I think, in thinking about the state in general in political science, but a very important insight to add to the literature on intervention, which has been just understanding itself as, we just go in and we build up capacity. So it was a real pleasure to read Shaha's, if you like, the extended version of this argument, or a separate part of the argument, which then also connects the argument about state transformation with an argument about the politics of scale. So if you imagine, if you like, this is the mental picture that I get from reading Shaha's work, that you have the state as this kind of multiple layers of governance that reaches down into the local level and goes up into the transnational level. what you also have are actors who mediate between and sort of operate between these different levels of governance. And actually political contestation happens at different scales, and one of the things that they contest is over what scale it has to happen at. So what this book does beautifully, absolutely beautifully, is show how both in theory and in practice the contestation over the level at which governance happens and the level of decision-making of politics is a fundamental part of, if you like, the experience and the phenomenon of trying to remake states. And it proceeds, I think, from the very clear insight that what international interveners tend to do when they go into post-conflict or fragile environments is to remake the state in a particular image shaped by discourses on new public management and so on, and to spread that at different levels of governance. So, I was delighted to read this, and so beautifully and clearly written as well in the book, in terms of the theoretical apparatus, and that's something I'll be drawing on, encouraging my students to read when they're thinking about state power. But also through the case studies. So we have 3 amazing case studies here of the Solomon Islands, Cambodia and Aceh, 3 sites where reconstruction activity has been absolutely extensive and which the 3 co-authors have an excellent grasp of. And the treatment of each case study is absolutely thorough. One of the things that I really like about the case studies, and the point that I try and make in my book as well, is that most analyses of intervention ignore the context. They ignore the countries that are being intervened in. So you'd often get write-ups of the politics of it with no historical chapter, right? Year 0 is the day the interveners show up, and nothing has kind of happened before that. What I really liked about all of the case study chapters in this book is that they give good historical sociological accounts of the structure of power and the political economy in each particular site, and they work through how this structures social forces and interests within those societies, and then how those interests then interact with the intervention structures. So the method is very meticulous, and it's also very sensitized to the spaces of intervention as spaces of real politics. In terms of the conclusions, I found the conclusions interesting. I look forward to talking more about them. Because on the one hand, I think the book has a very critical disposition to the purposes of intervention and the nature of the state. On the other hand, it sort of advises interveners to work with slightly fractured elites if they want to get things done, because they'll be able to mobilize the fissures in the groups and maybe be able to effect some limited reform. So I'd be interested to hear what Shahar has to say about taking the conclusions in that direction. And the other thing, and maybe just a short comment, I think, it's more a comment on the different focuses of our book. So my book tries to sit at the level of the targets of intervention and look out into the intervention structure. And I think what Shahar and Fabio and Caroline's book does beautifully is look at the internal dynamics, the internal political dynamics that also shape the struggles in each particular site. And although Shahar's earlier work looks more at the interveners, I thought it might have been nice to have a bit more of a story of, if you like, the politics of the interveners. But that does actually come through in the chapter on Aceh, where we see intra-donor conflict as one of the primary dynamics. I was absolutely just delighted to read this book. It's a fantastic book, and I'm just very happy to be able to talk more about it.